For joining us today for our conversation about terrorism in and from Afghanistan and Pakistan, and security and political developments in Afghanistan, the governance and stability and sustainability of the Taliban regime. I am Dr. Wanda Brown, Director of the Initiative of Nonstate Armed Actors and co-director of the Africa Security Initiative, as well as of the Fentanyl series at the Brookings Institution, where I am also a senior fellow. We are meeting here today to discuss these issues on the anniversary of Al-Qaeda's 9/11 attacks in the year 2000 on the US homeland. The bloodiest terrorist attacks the United States experienced. Al-Qaeda's awful terrorist attacks claimed the lives of almost 3,000 people in 2001, and the mourning and tragedy lasts. Let's acknowledge them with a moment of silence, as well as the many US soldiers and intelligence operatives who lost their lives or were injured in subsequent US efforts to stamp out terrorists with global reach. Thank you. The 9/11 attacks prompted a major reorientation of US policy that defined combating terrorism as the principal axis of US foreign policy. As part of the US global war on terrorism, the United States toppled the Taliban regime in Afghanistan that had been conquering in Afghanistan since 1994 and which by 1999 ran most of the country. It also hosted Al-Qaeda and provided safe havens for it. The United States then spent 2 decades fighting a resurrected and over time increasingly powerful Taliban insurgency while unable to induce accountable, equitable governance from post-Taliban authorities. When the US withdrew from Afghanistan in the summer of 2021, following the deal the Trump administration signed with the Taliban in Doha 2 years prior, the hollowed and ineffective authorities of the Afghan Republic rapidly folded. And with an unexpected speed, the Taliban took over the country. Our focus today is to examine how the Taliban has been ruling since it seized power in the summer of 2001. What kind of regime, with what internal structures it has put in place, how sustainable the regime is economically and politically, and how it treats its citizens. Of course, women, ethnic minorities, but as well as Pashtun people. We will also be looking at the Taliban's external policies, as well as policies in the security domain, such as its responses to terrorism and its engagement with counterterrorism issues. But more broadly, its trade and foreign policy agendas with countries in the region, such as Iran and its neighbors, Russia, China. And we will also, of course, examine US and international policy responses and the possibilities of imagining different policy responses. To that end, we are very fortunate today to have brought together a most knowledgeable set of very distinguished speakers with deep experience, knowledge, and connections in Afghanistan, on Afghanistan, to Afghanistan. I will introduce them each just before they speak. Because we are meeting today to talk about Afghanistan and terrorism issues on the anniversary of 9/11, I will start with the terrorism and counterterrorism picture and Professor Trisha Bacon. Professor Trisha Bacon is an associate professor at American University School of Public Affairs. There she directs the Policy Anti-Terrorism Hub. She is the author of very important pieces of work on terrorism, including 2 highly acclaimed books, Terror in Transition, Leadership and Succession in Terrorist Organizations, and Why Terrorist Organizations Form International Alliances. Dr. Bacon also comes in with a distinguished policy career. Prior to her employment at American University, she worked on counterterrorism issues in the US government for over 10 years, including in the Department of State's Bureau of Intelligence and Research, as well as the Bureau of Counterterrorism and Bureau of Diplomatic Security. Professor Bacon, in the Doha Agreement and well beyond the Doha Agreement, the Taliban was promising that it would not allow terrorist activities to leak out of Afghanistan to affect the regions and the rest of the world. It had never actually promised that it would end terrorism or not provide terrorist safe havens in Afghanistan. It was rather purposeful and consistent in its phrasing of no leakage out of Afghanistan. What is the actual picture? What's happening with terrorist groups present, Al-Qaeda in the country? What's happening with the Islamic State? And of course, the Tehrik-i-Taliban Pakistan. How consistent has the Taliban been in its promise to hold up crucial international obligations?
Thank you so much, Vanda, for convening us here today and for the opportunity to speak with this very distinguished panel. Your question really is the central one. And unfortunately, on this 23rd anniversary of 9/11, once again, the greatest terrorist threat to the West is emanating from Afghanistan. The state of the picture in Afghanistan today is in some ways familiar. The Taliban regime is harboring a number of foreign militant organizations that it believes or promises it can monitor, manage, and control. But this time around, the critical difference is there also is a terrorist organization, the Islamic State in Khorasan, that seeks to attack both within Afghanistan, including striking the Taliban, as well as more broadly in the region and beyond, including the West. And that is really the core threat emanating from Afghanistan today. There's four aspects of ISK that are worth distinguishing up front. One is, since it was formed as an Islamic State affiliate in 2015, it has really carved out an unusual position in a region where there is a proliferation of militant groups. ISK is the only solely rejectionist organization in the region, meaning it violently opposes all governments in the region and beyond. And this is in a region where most, if not all, other militant groups have at least one government backer, in some cases, the Taliban regime. So ISK is able to offer an alternative to new recruits and dissatisfied members of other militant organizations, and thus puts pressure on other organizations and shapes their calculus. ISK really offers this broad tent for those seeking to violently oppose the status quo. It has expansive ambitions to attack virtually anywhere it can do so, and it's transnational in its composition and its ambitions. Importantly, the group not only has the intent and capability to conduct and inspire attacks beyond Afghanistan, it's emerged as a linchpin in the Islamic State's broader attack network. So it has roles that range from being the primary architect of attacks, a facilitator of attacks, and an inspirer of attacks. And it appears to be equally comfortable in all three roles. The second aspect of the group that I want to mention is its resilience. It has demonstrated remarkable resilience to weather pressure and reemerge as a threat consistently since its formation. In the initial years of this organization, it was facing pressure from the United States, from the Afghan Republic government, and from the Afghan Taliban. That would be enough to seriously damage most organizations, let alone young organization like ISK was then. But ISK managed to weather that and reemerge consistently as a threat. It's now almost a decade old, and surely pressure from the Taliban alone will not be enough to seriously weaken this group over the long term. And since 2015, its attack patterns have been peaks and valleys. We see spurts of attacks followed by reductions in violence while it evades counterterrorism pressure, and then attacks will peak again. Since July 2022, its attacks in Afghanistan have declined. It has still struck soft targets in Afghanistan and attacked in areas controlled by the Taliban, but most importantly, since that time, its external operations have expanded significantly. And this brings us to carefully calibrating the threat from ISK. ISK in some ways defies our conventional thinking about strength of these organizations equaling threat. In this environment, we hear a lot about groups like Hezbollah, who are strong from a conventional standpoint. ISK doesn't necessarily have those same kinds of numbers or same kinds of weapon arsenals. Its strength is its threat is not derived from its strength. It's derived because it's so highly indiscriminate. It's willing to attack even maternity wards or schoolgirls taking tests. It's completely unrestrained in its targeting. And it's also highly opportunistic and will conduct attacks wherever it can and seek to inspire them elsewhere. It's not an organization like Al-Qaeda that sought to develop sophisticated attack capability to conduct an attack like 9/11. It seems to apply more of a minimum viable capability to conduct operations. It's willing to have a high rate of failure in order to have some major successes. So while some may argue this group is in some ways weak, that is not a good way to assess the threat from the organization, as it is now one of the most lethal militant organizations in the world. At the same time, CT efforts against ISK have serious limitations in the current international environment. Too many governments view the group through the prism of strategic competition, existing rivalries, or just plain conspiracy theories. The result is there has been insufficient counterterrorism cooperation between governments against the threat, which in times has led to deadly results when warnings have not been heeded. And this is also a major limitation to anyone who wants to propose cooperation with the Taliban against ISK, because the Taliban has repeatedly characterized ISK as a proxy for the United States, reflecting the kind of conspiracies that limit cooperation against the group. At the same time, we have this cadre of foreign groups that are aligned with the Taliban. It still hosts a slew of foreign groups who supported it during its insurgency against the United States. Among those is Al-Qaeda and its regional affiliate, Al-Qaeda in the Indian subcontinent. This comes at a time where Al-Qaeda is seeking to exploit the war in Gaza to regain momentum and reestablish its leadership in the Sunni jihadist movement. And the Taliban expresses confidence in its ability to manage these groups, though it is worth the caveat that it had such confidence in the 1990s as well. But this time that's complicated by ISK providing an outlet for those who are dissatisfied with the Taliban's approach. Importantly, the Taliban has not demonstrated a willingness, ability, or some combination thereof to constrain the Pakistani Taliban. This organization has really evolved and emerged as a much more sophisticated organization and resurged as a threat in Pakistan. In something of a role reversal, Pakistan now faces a threat from a militant group that finds haven in its neighbor, while the Taliban regime implausibly denies that the Pakistani Taliban has a presence in its border. And while Pakistan's plight may invoke limited sympathy in Washington, given Islamabad's support for the Taliban insurgency, it is notable that the Afghan Taliban's failure to prevent the Pakistani Taliban from using its soil for attacks suggests that there are serious limitations to its willingness or ability to fully manage militant groups that find haven in Afghanistan. So we're in an environment where there's limited international appetite for Afghanistan and for counterterrorism. We have strategic competition is the priority amidst a war in Ukraine, the war in Gaza, but terrorism remains a threat that can really disrupt these other priorities if insufficient measures are not taken to mitigate the threat.
Well, thank you very much, Trisha. And I would add that, of course, the issue of terrorism remains the primary agenda for just about all the regional actors dealing with the Taliban, as well as other actors. And I would also note that in the Crocus City Hall attack conducted by ISKP, Moscow went to great lengths not to blame the Taliban and not to associate the Taliban's management of internal security with the attack. Before I go to former Deputy Minister Assay, I just want you please to clarify to our audience or explain to our audience what is the Taliban-ISKP relationship, what kind of actions the Taliban has taken vis-a-vis ISKP.
So ISKP actively targets the Taliban and has virtually since its inception. It views the Taliban as an illegitimate government and an illegitimate actor. So there is an adversarial relationship. The Taliban has conducted operations against ISKP since before the US withdrawal, and it has increased those operations since its takeover. It has conducted crackdowns as well as more targeted operations against the group, and has been active in trying to mitigate the threat within Afghanistan from the group. It is, by some reports, even penetrated ISKP, but this has not resulted in ability to disrupt external plottings, as you point out, in the attack in Moscow, as well as one in Iran and numerous plots in Europe.
And I'll just add here that the Taliban has been rather effective in depriving ISKP of urban safe havens, but found it much more challenging when ISKP set up urban operations in the same way that Western and Afghan Republic counterterrorism efforts previously struggled with, which is a great transition to talk now, to bring into the conversation Deputy Minister Asay. And the question that I have to you is how stable and secure in power is the Taliban 3 years into its rules? What are its internal structures, cleavages, vulnerabilities? Mr. Tamim Asay is the executive chairman of the Institute of War and Peace Studies and of the Council on Foreign Relations of Afghanistan, both professional, non-government, and non-partisan national security and foreign policy think tanks based in Kabul. He's also a senior visiting fellow at King's College London and a graduate of the Royal College of Defence Studies in London. He was the former Deputy Minister for Policy and Strategy at the Ministry of Defense of the Islamic Republic of Afghanistan, as well as the Director General of International Relations and Regional Security Cooperations, and the former Director General of Policy and Strategy at the Office of National Security Council of the Afghan Republic. And Tamim is a super knowledgeable Afghan official and analyst. I could hardly imagine anyone better than him asking about the internal dynamics within the Taliban. Mr. Asay, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vonda, for this stellar panel. It's an honor to be part of this panel, to meet good old friends, Ambassador Newman, Dr. Nemat, of course, Professor Bacon. In terms of the stability of the Taliban regime, or the Emirate as they call it, Emirate currently is in charge of the 100% of the geography. They're in charge of the security of that geography as well. But the regime does not have stability. And it's one of the concerns that a lot of big Afghan interlocutors who are actually residing inside of Afghanistan right now, they've been consistently voicing to the Taliban leadership that security does not equal stability in Afghanistan. There are a lot of underlying factors that contributes to the instability of the Taliban regime. A lot of disenchantment, if you look at UN surveys, other independent surveys, some of them private, some of them public, that the underlying factors brewing and contributing to the instability of the Taliban regime are a mix of 4 factors. One is the internal struggles within the Taliban regime. People like Mullah Baradar is not happy. Siraj Haqqani is not happy with the edicts, with some of the policies. You would be surprised that an extremist like him does not like edicts of Mullah Haibatullah sitting in Kandahar. Then you have people like Abbas Taghzai, the current Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Emirate, publicly criticizing some of the policies, after which he was warned by Kandahar not to raise those concerns. And at the same time, you see people like, including the current Emir, asking and summoning various officials to Kandahar. As recent as a week ago, for example, in Balkh, he reiterated the fact that what he calls ita'at, which is obedience, and implementation of his edicts will be the backbone of the longevity of the Emirate. So in terms of the stability, one factor is the internal struggles which are within there. Then there's the population. they cannot deliver services. The government is still enacting so-called government. The ministers are acting ministers, and then different ministers and governors have loyalty to different factions of the Taliban. And essentially, the way they look at the government is as bonuses that they got from years of jihad. The third factor is their very anti-women gender apartheid edicts, which has completely isolated them within the international community as well as the region, partially also inside of Afghanistan. So that kind of contributes to the one of the factors that contributes to the instability of the regime. And then finally, it's the division of labor between what they call Dar al-Khalafa, which is where all the edicts come, where all the religious authority is kind of bestowed, which is in Kandahar, the main center of decision-making, versus Dar al-Hukuma, which is the center of governance. Now, Haibatullah is essentially another version of Ashraf Ghani in terms of micromanagement, because he is literally micromanaging everything in Kabul, in Kandahar. And a lot of the ministers in Kabul are powerless lame ducks. They pass paper on, and a lot of those ministers are not happy. People like Mullah Yaqub, the son of the first Emir, is completely a powerless person right now. Saraj Haqqani, as recently as a month ago, Saraj Haqqani's chief of staff was replaced by the Emir. His chief is one of his closest people sitting in his office. And just today, one of probably the most famous Uzbek commander of the Taliban, Qari Salahuddin Ayubi, resigned in protest. In an emirate that prides itself in unity, in discipline, there's a lot of anarchy brewing. But the success of the Taliban has been that they keep it under the wraps. That's why they have imposed so much media restrictions, reporting restrictions, and other things. The biggest, I think, one of the most important things that we should pay attention to is the social engineering project, or what some people call the state building project, that Haibatullah has undertaken. He essentially, what he's trying to do is trying to create a model Islamic country to be emulated, by his own words and the words of his spokesperson, by other Islamic countries, a Sharia-based government, creating sort of what I call Homo Talibanicus, like Homo Sovieticus that Stalin wanted to create. And he has started a series of very extremist measures, and it was very, I think, calculated, small steps, and then now it's getting bigger and bigger. He started with what he calls correcting how the people dress, how the people should look like as an Afghan. So grow a beard, wear this, and then imposing hijab on others, on women. Then he went on cleansing the bookstores and the libraries of books that are so-called against the emirate ideology. So the deputy minister of culture of the Taliban was going around looking for books which is contrary to the emirate's ideology. Then we saw plethora of edicts that he has issued, and then the final thing was the madrasa built that he has been building. Right now, there's an estimation of around probably 3 million Afghans who are now being trained in those madrasas, and they will be the base for Haibatullah, the main constituency. So therefore, the regime is both at the same time, is both engaged in a social engineering, cultural revolution type of a project, but also uses GDI and its police apparatus as a theocratic police state to suppress dissent and also keep a grip over Taliban rank and file. And they've also removed different centers of power, which was there, or at least warned them or sidelined them or took the power from them. So it's a pressure cooker, I think. And I would end with a quote from a very senior Taliban security official who warned Haibatullah in private that said that if there's going to be some sort of an explosion, internal implosion, in one wave, 12 provinces will go, and then another wave would be another few provinces until Taliban basically goes back to the southern Afghanistan. So they're very worried. And just last week, as I mentioned, Haibatullah publicly warned all Taliban leaders that if the current rate of cruelty and corruption in the emirate continues, the regime would not survive. Those are his words last week in Balkh province.
Well, thank you very much, Tamim, for those absolutely fascinating insights. Before I go to Dr. Nemad, I want to stay a little bit on this theme of pressure cooker implosion and obedience. Of course, the flip side of obedience and this one-man rule, micromanagement with the ultimate word that is to some extent being subverted or at least slow-walked in implementation on the ground in various ways, is that the regime or the one man, not really the regime, stops being completely responsive to even crucial poles of power. Now, of course, Haibatullah, with some extraordinary adroitness, has surrounded himself with powerful southern commanders such as Mullah Zakir to create the Praetorian Guard around him that benefits disproportionately as a Praetorian Guard from distribution of resources. But we saw various levels of pushback. You mentioned Baradar, you mentioned Yaqub, you mentioned Siraj. Where are we today? Are all those sideline leaders who are having their chief of staff officials removed, are they simply accepting? I mean, what are your thoughts on this balance between Haibatullah cowing everyone into obedience or in fact setting up the internal implosion?
So anybody who knows history of Afghanistan knows that you cannot run that country with edicts and decrees, sitting somewhere in one province and turning yourself into a machine producing various decrees. Otherwise, Babrak Karmal or the communists would still have been in charge because they were also another machine producing all sorts of edicts. In fact, the same words were conveyed to Haibatullah, that you cannot govern this country with edicts. Let me give you an example. The last edict, which was this last law, vice and virtue law, which was issued, Taliban figures like Siraj, Yaqub, and a few others, including Brother, told their commanders not to enforce it. Report to the emir, but in your provinces, be careful. For example, in Herat province, they tried to, they actually, within the first 48 hours, established checkpoints to start checking women whether they are complying to the new vice and virtue law. The governor intervened and took out all of those checkpoints from across the city inside Herat province. So historically, edicts and decrees, when it actually goes into implementation at the sub-local level, has always been what in a passive way resisted, because Haibatullah is not there in all provinces, in all districts to implement that. And part of the reason why he started his provincial travels, which he's now actually traveling, is because GDI reported to him that people are not implementing your decrees and people are not listening to you. So therefore, when it comes to this passive resistance and these centers of power within the Taliban, yes, they listen to him. Yes, they on surface, on face value, they are obedient. But down the line, they're all putting their hands up and making a dua and prayer that when would his heart issues prevail and he would die, because he does suffer from heart issues, serious heart issues.
Well, perhaps the surface implementation will have an echo in the Potemkin villages, and as Amir Haibatullah travels around the provinces, what he sees might be more of a window dressing than the full extent of implementation of his very brutal edicts. which is an excellent transition to now bring into the conversation Dr. Orsala Nemad, because part of how any entity rules is, of course, not just how it rules its own groups, what kind of structures of consultation and order it sets, but also how it rules citizens under its control. And we have seen very brutal and increasingly tightening Taliban rule with many dimensions of that tightening that I am delighted to have Dr. Orsala Nemad to explain to us and to detail to us. She is the director of the Development Research Group and a senior associate fellow at RUSI, a British think tank. She served as the director of the Afghanistan Research and Evaluation Unit from 2016 to 2022 and was a chairperson of the Open Society Foundation's branch in Afghanistan until July 2021. And she's also a trustee of Afghan Aid. For over 25 years, Dr. Nemad has led organizations focused on women issues, youth empowerment, education, and legal reform in Afghanistan. And as part of that work was awarded an award in 2000, the Amnesty International Award. She was also a Greenberg Award Fellow in 2008 and Young Global Leader at the World Economic Forum in 2009. So please, Orsala, what has the Taliban's governance been like toward its people, toward ethnic minorities, toward women? And of course, we're meeting just on the heels of very brutal edicts being issued amounting to what some have called gender apartheid.
Thank you very much, Vanda. Good morning, good afternoon, good day to all listeners. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with all of you today. And on this day, we stand together, united in remembrance on the 23rd anniversary of darkest days, probably one of the darkest days in the modern history, the 9/11 or the 11th of September. The tragedy of the 9/11 is one that the people in Afghanistan have experienced throughout these years since 9/11 happened, almost on weekly basis for over 20 years, either in the capitals and the cities or in the remote and far villages. So speaking about the Taliban's today, it's important to also remember what led to this 20 years of investment, which we have seen vanished as soon as the international military forces have left and the former republic government basically collapsed. The point that I wanted to make in terms of, what the Taliban's edicts are coming from, like what are they bases on? It's not something that was completely surprising to the Afghan people. We don't know, and yet it is hopefully a topic that will be covered by Ambassador Newman and other speakers. But the reasons that led the United States, among all other partners or allies of Afghanistan in 2019, to make an agreement with such a regime that hosted the perpetrators of 9/11, entrust them, is something that still the Afghan people don't understand. We've been, by we, I mean the Afghan women, but also in general, any non-Taliban Afghans are continued to be neglected and ignored in any conversation related to Afghanistan when it comes to formalities. And that in itself is creating this environment that there are more hopelessness in the world of diplomacy and in the world of actually being hopeful, politically speaking, more than in other ways. So the Taliban's sort of misogynistic policies continue to come one after the other. The most latest one, the most recent one is their recent so-called law, again, written or endorsed by the Supreme Leader, is creating and sparking a lot of debate even among the religious scholars and how un-Islamic and how unaccepted these laws are. And there are two sides of the story when looking into the Taliban governance, and particularly in terms and in relation with women. and their work and their education. There's one side that is not really justified on any grounds, whether Islamic or non-Islamic, and that is the one that is coming directly through directives from Kandahar, from the supreme leadership. And there's the other one that allows a level of flexibility and a level of understanding, which is with even some of the Taliban members also trying to sort of like close their eyes and let the Afghan people emerge and continue to struggle quietly and not with a lot of noise making from inside Afghanistan, but continue to struggle. Not a struggle in a kind of an anti-Taliban resistance or anything, but at least to struggle to survive, the struggle to continue actually some form of education for girls, something that is completely banned by Taliban, and the struggle to find ways and workarounds to reach the most vulnerable segments of the society, including women-headed families and so forth. So this is ongoing, and there are, of course, expectations from Afghan people in general that we should not let them alone. We should continue these efforts to ensure that, A, Taliban are kept accountable when they are treating half of the population in such sort of like draconian way, and B, to ensure that the Afghan people don't feel that they are left behind and left alone and repeat the history of the past. And on this day, it's also important to remind ourselves the danger that can come through Afghanistan once again. There are reports, there are evidences from different parts of the country, particularly in the eastern, southeastern parts, and even some parts of the northern region, that there are bases being established. There are activities that cannot be explained by the local population on who are these people who are not Afghan, who are coming and quietly residing in these places for some plans nobody knows related to where, and everyone fears. So there is an appearance end to the war. There is no suicide. Well, there are fewer suicide bombing and suicide attacks, and as mentioned by other distinguished panelists, those are sort of like labeled as the Daesh attacks or the ISKP attacks. So the war is not completely ended, but at least there is a significant reduction in actual violence. But there is a gradual war that Afghan people, in majority the youth and particularly the women, are experiencing. And I think there is a collective responsibility from the international community to address this gradual death that we are experiencing today.
So Arsala, for our audience, let's get specific about what the edicts are. So in the latest round of edicts, women are prohibited from showing up in the public space without being fully covered. The voice of women is not allowed in public spaces, whether this be singing or, for example, radio or newscast work, in which some Afghan journalists, female journalists, became very prominent and accomplished. Women are not allowed to travel long distances without a mahram, without a male guardian. Please just fill that picture of rules and restrictions. And you mentioned no education for girls. It's no education after primary education.
Grade 6. Yes. In addition to that, a few other points. There are also rules set for men, but they have to have beard long enough to be held like this. I don't know how to explain this in English, but somehow like long beard. And they have to all dress in local traditional dresses. And most importantly, music is completely forbidden. National cultural celebrations such as Nowruz, which is a very historical celebration across Afghanistan, such as Shab Yelda, the longest night of the year, and several others, are all also forbidden, and there are no permissions or allowance for celebrating these social cultural activities. So this law is an indication that the supreme leader of Taliban is aiming to take Afghanistan back to, I don't know, dark ages, somewhere that its women are completely illiterate, and somewhere that its men are also not able to think or be allowed to work beyond. And of course, there are lots of contradictions, because when it comes to TV, when it comes to media and the way that is being used, Taliban are more efficient in using the media and social media and publicity platforms. So whether there is a possibility or commitments or willingness to implement these edicts in complete full force or not is questionable. But the edict, the significance of this edict, this particular law is not an edict. This one is a very descriptive law. The significance of it is in this part that it allows the moral police from the propagation of vice and promotion of virtue, that they can use this to turn against women, particularly women activists, protesters, and anyone who challenges their restrictions in any harshest possible way that they can, because they will have a law in their hand to do that.
Thank you for filling in the details of the very dire picture of what it means living under the Taliban rule, particularly in areas where local Taliban commanders and officials do not have enough influence to slow walk, not implement, sabotage the implementation of many of the edicts, which is indeed happening in various parts of the country. Ambassador Newman, I want to turn to you now to your thoughts about the Taliban's foreign policy and its regional implications, how the region is responding to the Taliban, and on US policy options looking forward. What US policy is currently and what are the pros and cons of alternatives. Ambassador Ronald Newman is the president of the American Academy of Diplomacy. He has held a very distinguished career in US foreign policy in the State Department, where he served 3 times as ambassador to Algeria, to Bahrain, and finally to Afghanistan between 2005 and 2007. He has been deeply involved with Afghanistan issues beyond that appointment. And I should also mention that Ambassador Newman's father was also a US ambassador to Afghanistan. Ambassador Newman held many other distinguished positions. I only mention one as Deputy Secretary of State. So please, over to you, Ron, on your thoughts where the Taliban is in its own foreign policy and when the US is in foreign policy toward Afghanistan.
Wanda, thank you. Thanks to Brookings for including me in this panel, and really a level of discussion that one does not always get to in public panels. So I appreciate that. I'd like to start in reverse order in a sense. For one thing, because I think even though I'm completely out of government, I speak only for myself, I think I can talk about US policy with somewhat more authority than I can about Taliban policy. And I think it's important to talk about this, first of all, by distinguishing between policy and strategy. This is getting very muddled in the public discussion, simply because I think US policy is actually quite clear. Strategy is nearly non-existent. And and there's a reason for that. Policy is where you're trying to go. Strategy is how you get there. So the policy is actually pretty clear. Counterterrorism, first and foremost, given why we went to Afghanistan. And then, without trying to prioritize everything, stability, which involves an inclusive government, because nobody believes the Taliban government can be, or any government can really be stable in Afghanistan without being more inclusive. Some would translate that to mean democracy. That may or may not be necessarily the way stability and inclusion works in Afghanistan. Certainly a great focus on improving the lives of women, generally the provision of aid, humanitarian assistance, and counter narcotics. So those are all fine goals. And they're quite clear. Then the question is, how do you get there? Well, the US has almost no influence in Afghanistan anymore. It gave away all its policy tools when it decided to leave the Taliban in charge. And so it has now a smattering of actions which go toward those goals, but none of which are going to be in the least bit adequate to achieving any of them. But that is not because there's a lack of a great idea out there to achieve them. It's because of a lack of tools. So it's also because Afghanistan is a political issue with the United States, and you have the particular problem that policy tends to be fought in black and white, and Afghanistan is full of grays that make this very difficult. There are two examples of that. On aid, the policy is not to aid the Taliban. Aid is delivered, humanitarian assistance, not developmental, is delivered through NGOs. In the complex conditions of Afghanistan, it is not going to be possible to deliver aid through an extensive network of organizations and not have some degree of leakage. In the political context, if you say there is leakage, you are condemned. If you want no leakage, you can have no aid, which will leave a certain number of Afghans starving. But the nuance of that is very hard to sustain in a policy discussion. You have the same kind of problem with several other issues, but you may have some degree of contact on counterterrorism. I don't know. It's not an issue which I can. That's very highly classified. In any event, if you do, it's purely tactical and occasional. It's not strategic. You have a number of issues where the U.S. has tried to use policy. There was a hope of some analysts that the desire of the Taliban for recognition and for greater assistance would lead them to allow us a measure of influence. There was an analytically sensible position to argue, which turned out to have the debility of being completely wrong. In fact, I would say, to my unhappiness, that if you look internationally at the scene, the Taliban they're resentful about not being recognized, but they are gradually making progress. Their ambassador has been accredited in China, even though the Chinese say they're not. The Russians have turned the embassy over to the Taliban. The Kyrgyz are now recognizing their ambassador. The Uzbeks are creating trade relations. So the overall movement of states is in the Taliban's favor, although at a glacial pace. The regional states have maintained a coherence with the United States and with the West. And that's part of the American policy of not recognizing the Taliban. But the coherence is based on different premises. The United States is absolutely not going to recognize the Taliban as long as women are being treated this way. The regional states are, to generalize, much more concerned about implosion in Afghanistan, instability, terrorist movements, and movement of populations and refugees. So you have a superficial agreement on policy which does not fully represent a reality. There is in the Afghan diaspora a very strong residual demand that the U.S. somehow accomplish things which the U.S. cannot accomplish. I don't think it's going to change, and I don't think it's going to become any more realistic. So the challenge now for U.S. is, how does it maintain a certain level of aid without having that cut off? Can it do more to let the Afghan economy function without helping the Taliban directly? Because frankly, if you're not going to have enough money to feed Afghans, you ought to let the economy function so that Afghans have jobs and can feed themselves. That gets into banking restrictions. And then part of where we are now in policy is, I would say, a waiting game. We know of all these, we don't know of all of them, but we know of a lot of fractures in the Taliban, kind of thing that Tamim was talking about in detail. We know that the emir is not going to live forever, either because age and God will take him or somebody will help him out earlier. And we can assume that there will be a contention for power. We have no idea at that point whether things will be better or worse. Could be worse, although that's getting harder. Could also be better. But when this kind of moment happens, when there is instability within the regime, disunity, that's a time when the United States needs to be able to maneuver and talk to parties. And that is the strongest reason why the United States should resist the view that it should break off all contact. Because, and this is an issue which is more and more discussed, been several demonstrations in Washington, rather small, but lately calling for this. But once you break off contact, it becomes politically extremely difficult to resurrect it. And we've had that problem with Palestinians and others. So if you can maintain any level of contact and raise it up, lower it down, handle it tactically. Once you cut it off, you have to justify in a public political context resuming it. And that becomes slow, difficult, and at a minimum, it will absolutely cripple you if you want to move quickly. So it's important to maintain this. As to the Taliban, they're doing a fairly good job of continuing to assert that certain things are internal policies, that they are responsible government, that they are carrying out their obligations, that governments should recognize them and do more with them. So publicly, they protest a great deal against what is restricted, but at the same time, they're very slowly cutting away at the pressures on them. And I think in that sense, I don't know, but I would guess that they are probably not completely unhappy with where they are. Stop there.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Newman. This is great. I want to reiterate and give a little bit more detail to one point you made about humanitarian aid. If Western humanitarian aid, principally U.S. humanitarian aid, is cut off, we're not talking about a few Afghans dying. We are talking potentially about significant numbers of Afghans dying. 90% of the population is in poverty. At least 50% of the population depends on food aid. And to the extent that women are still getting some economic income, especially in families that are headed by women, it is often the result of Western aid going in through NGOs, other delivery mechanisms. So isolation comes with dramatic costs for the Afghan people and highly questionable effects, if any, on regime sustainability. Economic issues are one set of topics that I want to get in our conversation. I want to start taking, however, the many questions that have come from the audience already. Thank you all. Thank you very much to all of you who have submitted questions. We got several tens of them. I will be curating and picking among topics that we haven't covered. And let me stay on the U.S. policy question and the 9/11 significance and go back to you, Tricia, for your reflections on over-the-horizon counterterrorism. A principal core axis of the Biden administration was to extricate the United States from what it termed endless wars, to reorient U.S. foreign policy away from the global war on terror toward great power competition with China and Russia. And to an extraordinary degree, the Biden administration was successful in that project. Of course, it had to respond to issues such as Russia's egregious invasion of Ukraine. But even before the invasion, the whole orientation was not internal stability, not counterterrorism through local on-the-ground U.S. involvement, but a radical foreign policy shift to Asia-Pacific, to other issues. What are your views about the effectiveness, details of the over-the-horizon counterterrorism strategy?
Thank you for that question, Mon. I think that's a really important point. I think there's one aspect of it that we immediately have to sort of lay out there, which is that the threshold for CT action is much higher now than it was for many years after 9/11. The US has narrowed its threat perception in terms of which groups it is willing to engage in direct action against and use the military tools that it has. So there is both this over-the-horizon capability approach to counterterrorism, but there's a real narrowing of when the US is seeing it as necessary to use that capability. There has been...
And over the horizon means essentially airstrikes and missile strikes and drone strikes against particular targets.
Yeah, it primarily does. Essentially direct action from outside of the theater. In Afghanistan, this would be from the Gulf or from the sea or potentially from neighboring countries to use direct action such as primarily airstrikes. Yes, absolutely. And of course, it was used once in Afghanistan to kill Ayman al-Zawahiri in 2022. So there are certainly targets that still merit that kind of action. But again, the threshold appears to be quite high to actually undertake that kind of action. At the same time, the US clearly does also have some capability to monitor the situation in Afghanistan, as evidenced by the warnings the US gave to both Iran and Russia of pending ISK attacks. So there is still that kind of counterterrorism cooperation that the US is capable of, which is distinct from the over-the-horizon approach. So what I would say is the US is pretty constrained in its use of over-the-horizon capability, but it is still trying to engage in other forms of counterterrorism cooperation to mitigate threats coming from Afghanistan. The problem being, as I mentioned, that the international environment is much more problematic in terms of that kind of counterterrorism cooperation because of the strategic competition piece, the war in Ukraine, and other more pressing issues in a lot of these relationships.
And I would add here that Russian intelligence services and the Kremlin completely ignored U.S. warnings about the Crocus attack. Tamim, please let me go to you now. We have gotten quite a few questions about the treatment of ethnic minorities by the Taliban. You mentioned an Uzbek Taliban commander resigning just recently. Of course, the big breakthrough by the Taliban during the leadership of Mullah Mansour was that the Taliban expanded the tent beyond Pashtun actors and actively and very effectively recruited Uzbek, Tajik, Hazara, other dissatisfied militia actors in Afghanistan into the Taliban. Where are we in the Pashtun domination versus ethnic inclusion in Afghanistan today? And how does the concept of ethnic minorities today compare to the 1990s?
Well, the mastermind of Taliban's outreach to minorities or to northerners and central provinces was the second emir of the Taliban who was drowned in Pakistan. He was a pragmatist, Mullah Mansour. He was a businessman. He was truly a guy who was quite a pragmatist when it comes to that. He's not there. We have a current emir, Haibatullah, who has built an Orwellian state. He's the big brother. And then there are ministries of truth and ministries of good and ministries of evil, all these different ministries that he has put. And then he has got a police state, a police apparatus in this form of GDI, who is in charge of implementing his ideologies. And you have an Orwellian state in charge of a Kafkaesque population. And in that Kafkaesque population who don't know why they're being treated this way and why they're being, put in these all sorts of problems, is the question of minorities. Now, if we look at the treatment of Talib commanders who gave so much sacrifice to ensure that the emirate becomes what it is right now, from Hazaras, from Uzbeks, from Tajiks, you will see that Haibatullah has a very different approach than Mullah Mansour. And his approach is this way. I am the ideological demigod who is in charge of implementing Sharia. And minorities here have a symbolic role. The power is concentrated. If you look at Taliban's cabinet level appointments, governor, and then also corps commander appointments, police chief appointments, 70% of these people are Kandaharis, from Lower Kandahar, from Greater Kandahar. And then within that, if you look at it based on the researches that we did, more than 50% of them come from one particular tribe, that Nurzais. Nurzais do not have a history of ruling Afghanistan. It has been Popalzais and the Duranis who have had a history of ruling Afghanistan. And the message that Haibatullah has been pushing is, it's not only the Pashtuns, it's not only the minorities, but even within the Pashtuns, he has segmented different Pashtuns, like the Eastern Pashtuns or like the third-tier Pashtuns, and then you have the provinces around Kandahar, which are Helmand, Farah, those provinces are the second-tier Pashtuns, and then you have the Nurzais within Kandahar who is in charge and doing that. So Tajik commanders, Uzbek commanders, today actually, one of them, Salahuddin Ayubi, resigned, a prominent Uzbek commander. They have killed, if you remember at the beginning of the initial first 6 months of the emirate, there was a prominent Hazara commander who rebelled because he did not agree with some of the policies. He was arrested at the beginning, and then he was shot to be made as an example to other Hazara commanders. So minorities in Afghanistan have two choices, basically, both if they're Taliban, within Taliban ranks or outside. Obedience or pay the price and have a symbolic role, because they believe, especially the Kandahari Taliban, that they have been at the receiving end of a lot of the war that has been happening in the last 20 years. They have given so much sacrifice. Now it's their time for them to be rewarded for their sacrifices. And the Tajiks and the Uzbeks and the Hazaras did not play a major role in the resurrection of the emirate. So they should have, probably the most prominent Tajik or minority person in Taliban's emirate is Qari Fasiuddin, the chief of army staff. You don't find anybody above that. The rest have only symbolic, decorative type of roles.
So one dimension is the extent to which ethnic minorities are included in the Taliban ruling structures. And you have in fact spoken about the Pashtunization, and not just Pashtunization, really very narrow tribal-based leadership appointment taking place, and the departure of ethnic minority, the departure or shuffling of Taliban ethnic minority commanders. The other dimension, of course, is that the Taliban has not accepted many of the power brokers, ethnic power brokers, Afghan Republic power brokers into this leadership structure. So that inclusion has not taken part of, and the Taliban has been deeply opposed to that idea. What about violence and a kind of outright physical brutality, Tamim, against ethnic minorities? So the 1990s, of course, were notorious for massacres of Shia Hazara people.
Yep.
What does it look like today in that aspect?
So if you compare the brutalities towards, or let's say Emirate policies, Emirate 1.0 in the 1990s versus Emirate 2.0 in the current Emirate that's in charge. Yes, one of the hallmarks of Emirate 1.0 was the Shamali Plains massacre, was the Yakaulang massacre of the Shamali Plains was Tajiks, the Kapisa Parwan provinces where Massoud was fighting, and there was a retribution attack by the Taliban, where they even burned the trees and everything, let alone, and took a lot of the women with them. And this is documented by the UN, which is there up on the website. The Yakaolang massacre that happened in Yakaolang area in central provinces against Hazaras. But right now, what is happening, the current policy of the Emirate towards the minorities, it's not as bad as the 1990s, but it's more systematic and more legalized in a way in terms of discriminatory approaches, whether it's systematic targeting of former ANDSF officers and soldiers who were Tajiks or Uzbeks or Hazaras, if they were particularly in the commando and special forces, whether it's in terms of imposing certain limitations in the way they could celebrate, for example, Ashura, the commemoration of Imam Hassan, Imam Hussein, death, whether it is whether they could publicly preach their religion. That's all. They've also confined them. If you look at the Emirates book, which is actually written by the current Supreme Chief Justice with a foreword by Hibatullah, and there are two things which is completely spelled out, that the religion of the Emirate is Hanafi, so all religious minorities need to either submerge or do their practices not publicly. And then the second thing is that whatever that is written in that book, that whatever commemorations or practices they do, it should be subject to the permissions and approvals of the Emirate. So whether it's in terms of ideology, whether in terms of their practices, whether it's their celebrations, they need permissions, and they need all sorts of restrictions and limitations are imposed on them, so as to portray a society which is completely Hanafi, as well as completely defined within the Kandahari Pashtun vision of Hibatullah.
Thank you. Excellent remarks and details. Orsala, let me turn to you. We received a set of questions about how to support life of ordinary Afghans, of course, including women and girls. Ambassador Newman had already spoken about some of the humanitarian aid being crucial and being distributed. What are the other mechanisms Afghan people or the international community is trying to go around the restrictions, such as education over internet, other dimensions of what is being done or what, in your view, can be done?
Thank you. When it comes to what can be done, there is a lot that can be done and should be something that we should all commit to. One, the whole idea of continuation of humanitarian assistance is critical because of a massive food insecurity and Afghanistan also being challenged by different climate aspects of crises, such as, drought in some places or unexpected floods and rains and landslides and earthquakes and so on. So the emergency, in as well as different humanitarian actions, is a must to be continued, but under a very strict scrutiny that, as the Ambassador Newman mentioned, these leakages is not to an extent that everything ends into the hands of a minority, whether this is the Taliban authorities or the intermediary actors framed as, community interlocutors and so forth. So the more accountability and transparency to humanitarian projects, the better and more effective. When it comes to education, I must say that 2 years on from the systematic ban against girls' education, there is no kind of online and internet-based or underground education that can replace, that can address the dire need of formal education for Afghan girls. As I mentioned, there are workarounds because an absolute majority of people that I work with on a daily basis and people that we know through our years of working across Afghanistan, absolute majority of people, traditional, non-traditional, more conservative, less conservative, they don't accept this ban on education. They don't even know where it is coming from. Because this leader, nobody knows who he is, what is his family background and where he comes from. Because even from Kandahar, people disagree with this fatwa against girls' education. So because nobody accepted male and female are not satisfied or convinced that this is an Islamic decision, they know that there is some level of politics involved in this whole ban. There has been efforts to sort of like create some sort of a space to allow girls to go and use, educational facilities. Unfortunately, it becomes a bit class-based because those who can afford, for example, to pay for private courses, they can attend some of the private courses in certain provinces. But public universities, public education above the grade of 6 is still banned, and it's problematic. So on this particular front, while online and alternative educational initiatives needs to be supported systematically and more in a with a focus on quality, because now anyone is randomly just into this business of online education without attention to quality, I think it's critical to also keep the push harder and harder in ways and in areas and platforms where it is possible to ensure that there is some level of flexibility from the Taliban side to allow it, in particular on critical and crucial matters like the medical university. Yes, they're allowing midwifery, and I know that there are nurses going and attending in certain fields like nursing, dentistry, physiotherapy, midwife. These kind of trainings are allowed and permissible, but medical is critical. And some doctors, some well-respected doctors are coming up front and sharing their daily now, like this is about the consequences of the years of war where we don't have enough female doctors. And they say, look, if today we are facing with this situation to treat a woman who is very like modest and doesn't want a man to treat them, but they have no choice because there is no doctor to treat them who is a woman. So imagine a few years on when we face with the consequences of these bans, what will happen? Another very important thing that is very individualistic. We have a lot of active social media commentators and critiques of this and that and the other, Afghans and non-Afghans. And through this platform, I call on all of them that they have to just to start the accountability from themselves and just pick and choose through their own trusted networks individual girls and support their education. I think I will also not miss to call on, the Fulbright and Chevening scholarships and any other government scholarships to dedicate, instead of like completely neglecting Afghanistan from their list, to dedicate their scholarships to girls only. We have extremely talented, treasures hidden across the country. I work on a daily basis with girls to help them to at least find some scholarship somewhere. And unfortunately, in a lot of cases, what we have experienced so far is more talks and more public statements and less action. There are, of course, positive stories. 19 girls made it to Scotland with the, continuing their medical studies. I think that's an excellent example that I wish many foundations, trusts, and governments particularly look into this, because if Afghanistan remains in the place that the Taliban are trying to head it towards, then the danger and the risks that are coming and emanating from there will face the whole world the same way that 9/11 was an indication of that. So we have to join our hands together to sort of like look into solutions and filling the existing opportunities that exist.
Thank you very much for those detailed thoughts. Just one very quick follow-up. So one of the questions that we got in different guises is asking whether there is any evidence to the fact that Taliban leaders are sending their daughters to education in places like Qatar and the Middle East. Your quick reaction to that?
Well, I mean, my immediate reaction is that, again, according to public sources, the spokesperson of Taliban in Qatar, his daughters went to school in New York, where he was based. So maybe my New Yorker friends or listeners to this can bring further evidence to this. Taliban, some of the Taliban leaders who actually have, I mean, very few of top leaders obviously have their families back to Kabul. But those whose families are back to Kabul, they send to women-only universities their girls. They used to send them, and they try to find ways. So they cannot even convince their own female members of their families. But these are the kind of Taliban that will not sit with you and say that, yes, this is Islamic, this ban is Islamic. They are on your side. They say it's un-Islamic, but what can we do? We have to be obedient to our leader. But why this leader is doing this, that's why I'm saying this is not acceptable. The only thing that explains this ban is much more a type of an agenda that goes beyond Afghanistan to keep this territory, this geography in darkness, and make it available to use for all kinds of activities that nobody can question. That is the only explanation that we sort of like come to conclusion to have. Other than that, it's nothing to do with Islam, it's nothing to do with culture, it's nothing to do with the society. We all know how much desire is there from Nimroz to Badakhshan, and from even very conservative sort of like Pashtun areas in the East Coast, all the way to, you know, like Nangarhar and Laghman and Kunar, how they accept all kind of traditional conservative sort of like mindset to send their girls to hostels within the provinces. Like Nangarhar hostel until the day of ban was full of girls from eastern regions coming and attending universities from Kunar, from Nuristan, from Laghman. So because they believe in education. And it's the same with Kandahar. Fathers travel from different districts to Kandahar city, renting like a room or a flat where they can ensure that their daughter can get education. I mean, these are like first-hand experiences we have. So the society is absolutely fine with girls getting education to a higher level. It's just the mindset of a very tiny minority within the Taliban that even the Taliban themselves don't agree with it. And that's why there has to be like the pressure points has to be sort of like pushing to those particular elements to see a result.
Thank you. Trisha, I want to come back to you in a sec about Pakistan. But Ron, Ursula made this very powerful plea. The international community has to commit itself to continuing humanitarian aid. In practice, most of the aid has been coming from the US and the overwhelming majority from the United States. But of course, it's a different world. There is still starvation in parts of Ethiopia. Somalia is going through starvation, the worst humanitarian crisis in the Democratic Republic in Congo, and the most violence in many years. There's a lot of pressure on aid, not to mention Ukraine. Your thoughts on how to ensure that Afghanistan doesn't fall off the screen. And I should also mention Haiti, where more than half of the population is starving.
Thank you, Vanda. Public pressure is extraordinarily important, but I think you need to start from the recognition that aid to Afghanistan is likely to continue to decline. I don't think it's going to go away entirely. But the combination of budget pressures overall, the number of issues you raised, I think this is the likely political direction. I don't like it. I'm opposed to it, but I think that's where it's going to go. This has probably has several different issues that it raises. One is there needs to be a redoubled effort to figure out how to let the Afghan economy function better without necessarily strengthening the Taliban government. For instance, there are legal transfers of money that are not being made because U.S. banks are petrified that they will find themselves in the crosshairs of government regulations and sanctions. So U.S. banks are more are imposing more sanctions than U.S. policy imposes. That's a huge impediment for Afghan business. Secondly, I totally agree with Dr. Dima that online education is not a substitute for girls being back in school. But in the absence of girls being back in school, it is enormously important to support the online education efforts that are going on. Now, there's a wide variety of them, and they probably are of different qualities. I think some of them are very high quality, others may be more questionable. There is a large problem overall that donor support for that education is falling away. It was strong in the beginning when Afghanistan was headline after the withdrawal. And as Ukraine has come up particularly, this is pulling away donor support. And so university programs that are launched for in-country online education are struggling for money. So are many others. So people on the call who have friends, no friends, or have the ability to contribute to these causes really need to think about it if they care about these things, because they may not be perfect. But I tell you, I've been on calls with some of these girls who are doing online programs who've never been out of the country. Their level of English is fantastic. The optimism that they still retain is amazing. Their sense that this online education has kept open a door, no matter how small a crack, that keeps them from despair. These are really powerful things, and donors are losing sight of it. You know, donors are a little bit like little kids playing soccer. They tend to all run after the same ball.
I'm very glad that you mentioned the psychological aspect and the psychological boost of the online classes, which of course one element of it is the actual learning, but the other element is just engagement outside of the family that has become so difficult for many Afghan women and girls. Trisha, I want to come to you to Pakistan. You in a very diplomatic manner handled the issue of Pakistan. I will be more explicit that there are people who believe that Pakistan is getting its just comeuppance with TTP attacks after for decades supporting the Taliban with intelligence, weapons, materials, supporting some of the most vicious branches of the Taliban, like the Haqqanis. But Pakistan has been very frustrated. He's not been able to direct the Taliban leadership in the way it assumed it would be directing the Taliban leadership, and has pulled out cards like sending back Afghan refugees, only to find out that those cards don't work. And in fact, halted sending back Afghan refugees, not because it's a brutal policy, but because it was not yielding any results. It restarted so lately and became concerned it would run out of refugees and kill yet another pressure tool. What are your thoughts about Pakistan's counterterrorism policies and the rumors, the kind of ideas being floated about that if Pakistan does not start seeing more responsiveness from the Taliban towards its interests, it might start engaging, supporting, cultivating ISKP?
So I think from a historical perspective, we know that when Pakistan has an Afghan client that is not producing results or is not compliant, they start to look for others. The Taliban is a product of that approach. I think the problem for Pakistan right now is that there isn't really an alternative that it can support. I don't think that Pakistan has often had a dual track approach of supporting some militant groups while countering others. ISKP, on the other hand, supporting ISKP would take that to a particularly illogical level, given that ISKP's agenda in Pakistan is as robust as it is in other places. It's conducted massive attacks there. And also, ISKP is not a viable client It is not a manageable client. It is not an organization that is willing to be a proxy for a government. That is, in fact, its main brand in the region. So I think it's unlikely that that would be a fruitful way for Pakistan to go forward, and would be a particularly pernicious effort if it were to do so, and in fact really sort of counterproductive for its own interests. Having said that, I don't see a viable alternative to the Taliban at this point for the Pakistani government. It may try to cultivate certain factions of the Taliban more closely, particularly the Haqqanis, a long-lasting client, but the Haqqanis are among those that have worked extensively with the Pakistani Taliban. So I think that it's a particularly intractable situation where Pakistan is finding it doesn't really have the carrots or the sticks it needs to change the Taliban's policy towards the Pakistani branch of the Taliban. So I think that we're likely to see increasing violence in Pakistan by the Pakistani Taliban, coupled with, of course, growth in attacks in Balochistan, and the insurgency there, which both have the combination, could have a real destabilizing effect on Pakistan.
And I would also add, of course, the stabilizing effect on the China-Pakistan relationship, with Pakistan long promising to China that it can continue its policy of dividing militant groups between the good ones that serve its anti-India interest and the bad ones, and managing them effectively not to impinge on Chinese security and economic interest. But Pakistan has been struggling with that, given the activities of TTP and Baluch actors. Tamim, we are almost at the end, but I would be very negligent if we did not at all touch on a subject that deserves its own webinar, and that's the Afghan economy. This, of course, is critical for the lives of Afghan people. We spoke about 90+% of people being in poverty and having seen far greater and more onerous levels of poverty than was the case under Afghan Republic. The economy is, of course, a crucial element of the sustainability of any regime, any government. Please, in the remaining 3 minutes before I move toward closing the webinar and thanking everyone, give us your thoughts on the economic developments and situation in Afghanistan and how they affect the regime stability. Tamim, do we still have you?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, thank you, terrific.
I'll make the best out of my economic studies at Columbia University to, in 3 minutes, sum it up for you. So the emirate is trying to build what they say is an Islamic economy. The budget is with the emir. It's a black hole. Nobody knows. He has completely monopolized the budget. And he literally now hands over, works in handouts. There's no transparency on the budget. It's around $2+ billion dollars of budget that they are using through recurrent revenues. But to Taliban's credit, Taliban is the only, it's the only Afghan government or Afghan entity that is now in charge of Afghanistan that is not reliant on foreign aid indirectly. In terms of monetary policy, they have maintained the stability of the Afghan currency, but that's on the back of that $40 million that goes for foreign aid as a part of pumping into the economy for foreign aid organizations in Afghanistan. So in terms of there are various different statistics. If you look in the recent World Bank report, there are certain, it's an autocratic economy where they are trying to build a self-sufficient economy. They have this fascination, infatuation almost, to big mega projects, like any authoritarian big regime. They started with Qoshtepa. It didn't go anywhere because of environmental issues and because of also other projects. Today they went to, for the third or fourth time, to inaugurate TAPI, the Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, India pipeline. So they have the hallmarks of their economic policy is a very dark kind of unaccountable budget held by the emir in Kandahar, the monetary policy semi-successfully managing, the foreign currency and the Afghan economy's value, the Afghan currency's value, the Afghani, but that is highly dependent on the money that's being pumped in on dollars to maintain the stability. But it's a closed economy, and like all Islamic groups, whether it's Muslim Brotherhood or others, if you look at it, they're good at fighting, but they're struggling to figure out with governance and the economy. It would be also a mess if I don't contribute to Dr. Nemat's discussion, or the question that was addressed to Dr. Nemat from one of your audiences in terms of the daughters of the Taliban leaders studying abroad. I would contribute that Deputy Foreign Minister Abbas Stanigzai's daughters study in the UAE in Dubai as we speak. Deputy Prime Minister for Political Affairs Molay Kabir's daughters study in Rawalpindi. And if Muttaqi's daughters actually studied in Quetta, I can go on and on, but I think I would stop at those three examples of the double policy that the Emirate has when it comes to the rest of the population versus the leaders' sons and daughters' education. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Deputy Minister Tamim Assaif, for your absolutely insightful remarks throughout our conversation. I'm delighted that you could join us. Equal thanks to Dr. Orzala Nemat for her very prescient and still very on-the-ground engaged information and insights that she shared with us, and her work on Afghanistan. Ambassador Ronald Newman is also one of exemplary U.S. policymakers really dedicated to following closely Afghanistan and supporting Afghanistan over many decades. Thank you for joining us today and your insights. And finally, enormous thanks also to Professor Trisha Bacon for contributing her extraordinary knowledge and nuance of terrorist issues around the world, and specifically today in our conversation on Afghanistan and Pakistan. All of our speakers are frequent writers, often commenting in the public domain. And those of you who are interested in terrorism, in Afghanistan, in US policy, I highly recommend following their work closely. Thank you very much to our audiences for joining us today. I am grateful that you are watching the programming of the initiative of Nonstate Armed Actors and of the Africa Security Initiative that I direct. We will have many more programs coming across the fall on different parts of the regions and different issues. Thank you and goodbye for now.